A handful of structures that we learned on the stomach. The first two, the cardia and the fundus, are really, really deep underneath the liver. So I'm gonna have you guys still find those, but just for like convention's sake, it's gonna be very difficult for us to actually pin those in an exam situation. So you can kind of note that those two are less likely to show up, if showing up at all. And then if you flip to the liver, yeah, everything else we're gonna know. Flip to the liver. For the liver, I just want you to know the liver. So cross off every X in that box except liver. The ducts and everything are really difficult to see, and oftentimes we end up breaking the liver completely apart before we even discover the vessels. So it's not a great system, but definitely in that case, make sure that you're paying attention to the models, right? Because we're crossing off of this, so they're more likely to show up in models. Okay, so we'll start on page 10 of This Is All Up and Going. And first thing you need to know on the cat is the external nares. So you can't see the nose too well on this, but if we were to put a pin literally in the cat's nose, we'd be asking for the external nares. Alright? Alright, next we have the larynx, and if you remember from Monday, and even if you look on this sheet, you'll notice that the larynx is composed of a whole bunch of different structures. The two main ones, and the ones you need to know in the cat, are the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. So if we look on the cat, basically you see this jugular coming across right here. Just below that, you have a thick cartilage here and another one just below it. This is the thyroid cartilage. This is the cricoid cartilage. Now, if we were to pin anything in this region between the thyroid and the cricoid, those two borders, and ask you to identify the space, then we'd be asking for the larynx, okay? Because those two cartilages, those are essentially the structures that we can see externally that make up the space in the respiratory system. So the tube itself, the inside of the tube, that's the larynx, okay? So if we were to pin this one right here, so the thyroid, remember, it's the one on top, it's wider, and it's shaped like a chevron. Those are some things to describe this guy. If we were to pin this and ask you for the structure or the cartilage, then we'd be asking for thyroid. Same for the cricoid. If we pin this and ask you to identify the cartilage or structure, we're asking for cricoid cartilage. Now, cricoid cartilage, remember, it's just going to be the first cartilage after that thick chevron-shaped thyroid cartilage, okay? After that, the rest of the cartilaginous rings we see are going to belong to the trachea. So the trachea is going to follow the same naming components. Although with this, it's actually really difficult to pin a cartilage on the trachea because they're very tough, obviously, and they're kind of small. We're still going to word the question appropriately, so if we're asking for the trachea itself, we'll be asking you to identify this space. If we want you to identify the cartilage, if we pin the cartilage, then we just say ID structure, okay? Now, note that on this, you see that there's like brown and white stripes. The brown will actually be the cartilage, and the white will be the membranous trachea, okay? So if we were to pin the membrane between the cartilage, then it would only be trachea, okay? All right, so that's trachea. And then we have lungs. Okay, I was like, where am I? Obviously, the lungs are going to be on either side of the heart. You don't need to identify the individual lobes of the lungs. Just know that they're in the thoracic cavity, basically the only other organ in the thoracic cavity other than the heart. Do keep in mind, though, if we pin the lungs, depending on what the question's asking for, we could be asking you to identify the lungs, or we could be asking you to identify the visceral pleura. So if we pin this and we're asking for the membrane or the layer, we're asking for the visceral pleura. If we pin this and we're asking you for the organ or the structure, we're asking for the lungs. The last thing you'll need to know for the respiratory system is the diaphragm. Remember from last time we looked at the cats, the diaphragm was that thick layer of muscle that separated the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. Hopefully the diaphragm is still intact in your cat, but you'll see it just inferior to the lungs, right here. All right, any questions for the respiratory system?
Can you repeat what you said about the trachea again?
Yes, so the trachea, if we're trying to decipher the trachea from the tracheal cartilages, the brown is actually the cartilage, and the white is the membrane in between the cartilages. So if we pin the white, that's only going to be cartilage, or excuse me, that's only going to be trachea. If we pin the brown, we'll be asking for the cartilage, but note, if you're unsure what we're looking at, we're going to try to specify in the question ID space, so that you understand that we're asking for the trachea, versus ID structure. And the only reason we'd make that decipher is because, as you'll see, it's really hard, especially on an exam, if you're looking at a really thin pin going through a really thin structure, to tell the difference between whether it's in the brown or in the white. All right? Yeah. Any other questions? All right, so we'll move on to the digestive system on page 12.